Hi everyone, and thank you for tuning in to this spotlight recording from the school's mental health network in Warwickshire. I'm Dan Lake, and I'm joined on this session by Dawn Priest, and we are specialist senior educational psychologists with a specialism in supporting children and young people's social, emotional, and mental health needs. In this spotlight, we're going to be focusing on sleep and the impact on young people's learning and well-being. This spotlight recording, as ever, is a shorter digest version of the original network session, and the aims for this session were to touch on the science behind sleep, which we'll introduce in a moment, and to have an opportunity to explore different strategies and resources to support good sleep hygiene. So let's start with a definition of what we mean by sleep, because sleep is generally associated with having your eyes closed and laying down, but that's not always the case. So the definition reads as follows. Sleep is a naturally recurring state of body and mind characterized by altered consciousness, we're asleep, but that can be reversed, relatively inhibited sensory activity, so our sensory awareness is reduced, but again, that can be reversed. Inhibition of nearly all voluntary muscles, so we're very physically relaxed. And of course, reduced interactions with our surroundings, so being aware of what's happening around us. Sleep is a reversible state of consciousness. And as we're about to see over the coming slides, it's a highly complex, chemically driven process. And we're hoping that the next few slides will help clarify that a little. So in terms of trying to talk through that complexity of the sleep process, we wanted to introduce you to this chart here. This is a hypnogram, and it shows the different stages of the sleep process. So there are four main stages of sleep. Non-REM sleep, which consists of three stages. So they are, stage one is when we're in a lighter sleep and we're easily woken. Stage two is when we are still in a light sleep, but we're preparing to fall into that deeper sleep. And stage three is the deep sleep. And then we have REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement. And it's a unique stage of sleep where our eyes move quickly and in different directions. And during this stage, our brain is very active, even though our body is still. We can think of this as the time when we have our most vivid dreams, but your body is still resting. And it's an important part of the sleep cycle that helps with memory and learning. And when we think about the children and young people that we support, and we think about the quality of their sleep cycle per night and their sleep hygiene, there's a few important things to bear in mind related to this graph. So firstly, it takes about 10 to 15 minutes to move from being awake to that deeper sleep, depending on your age, but also your surroundings and your environment. Sleep cycles tend to last, going through those four stages, around 90 minutes. And each one ends with REM sleep. So you can see the red bands on this slide here are those periods of REM sleep. And we naturally stir after each, even though we might not remember it. Each bout of REM sleep gets longer as the night goes on, and that's particularly significant when we consider the impact of cutting sleep short. If we set our alarm so that we wake in the morning halfway through a cycle, it can be a lot harder to get going in a morning. And you'll notice as well from this chart that much of the deep sleep occurs at the beginning of the night, and the lighter sleep and REM occurs more frequently in the morning. Hence that idea that we get this sense that we've just woken from a dream. But that's particularly important for the children and young people we support, because if the majority of our restorative sleep, the deep sleep, is happening in the first few hours of being asleep, what do the environment and circumstances look like? What are the sleeping circumstances like for the young person that you're thinking of when they're going to bed? Is the house and the sleeping conditions as pristine as they would ideally need them to be? And I guess a key finding from this hypnogram that sticks with me is that it shows that we wake up 4 to 5 times a night. And depending on how the bedroom looks and feels, we're going to come on to this later, how the bedroom looks and feels when the young person naturally stirs, that will determine whether they easily slip back into sleep or whether they then feel quite disturbed and they're awake for sections of the night. So carrying on this theme of what is sleep and how does the sleep process work, there's a few things that we wanted to pull out using this slide. The first is our circadian rhythm, our internal body clock. And when we're thinking about the conditions of the bedroom and the pristine conditions that we'd ideally have for our best night's sleep, it's worth pointing out that light is the biggest external control of our circadian rhythm, our sleep cycle every night. There are other factors such as background sound, mealtime, how recently we had a mealtime before going to bed, the temperature of the room, and also social clues. So what are the rest of the household doing? Are they still up and about? Are they playing games? Are they working? Or are they also winding down and going to sleep as well? And these cues work together to kind of keep that body clock on a loosely 24-hour cycle per person. But our troughs and our peaks of circadian rhythm do also differ slightly from one person to the next. And that's why you sometimes hear people talk about being more of a morning person or a night owl. The second really important factor, the most influential chemical for sleep, is melatonin. During the day and throughout the day, the brain releases many chemicals that build up and lead to us feeling tired. And one of those key chemicals is melatonin. And it occurs naturally in our bodies. It helps us to know when we're getting that sense of starting to feel sleepy. And it starts being produced in the evening when the light is fading, which is another reason to think about those bedtime conditions in the wind down to bedtime, that wind down to sleep. Are we setting calming music? Are we dimming the light? So we're getting the room temperature just right, because all of that will help with the production of melatonin. And then the third area is adenosine. Adenosine is another chemical that plays a key role in making us feel sleepy. As we go about our day, adenosine levels gradually build up in the brain. The more adenosine you have, the sleepier you will feel. And when you sleep, your body breaks down that adenosine overnight, which helps you to feel refreshed and awake, like you've got a clean slate again the next morning if your sleep has gone well. So think of adenosine as it's kind of like a natural signal that your body thinks it's time to rest and that it's time to recharge. But it's also worth thinking about in those evening routines. We can either accidentally or intentionally sometimes mute the effects of adenosine. And how do we do that? Well, caffeine. So we need to be thinking about, where are those cuppers coming in an evening? Where is that young person? Are they having any energy drinks too close to bedtime, etc., etc.? But these aren't the only chemicals involved. We've simplified the process. In truth, there are 16 chemicals involved in going to sleep. And it's that cocktail that's really important for helping us to wind down and to avoid feeling too awake, so that we can move into those different stages of sleep.
Thanks, Dan. So I'm going to focus on what happens to the individual if they don't have enough sleep. However, it is important to remember that sleep difficulties impact on the entire family, not just the individual. So it will impact on the parents, and it will also impact on any siblings in the house. But on an individual level, it's important to bear in mind that a lack of sleep means that the young person is less likely to be able to attend to their learning, will have reduced concentration, and it will also impact on their memory. And this is particularly important because memory is consolidated during sleep, and this is where our memories become overall improved by having good sleep. And non-REM stage sleep is particularly important for memory consolidation, particularly procedural learning and the impacts that has on implicit memory, which is remembering what we need to do, how we approach tasks, what skills we need to do. So how you would, for example, remember how to ride a bike. Also, a lack of sleep can impact on non-REM sleep stage 3, which is involved in recognizing our memories. And it's a bit like a memory transfer, like using a memory stick. So it transfers what we have done into our long-term memory. And finally, sleep difficulties impact on our REM sleep, which involves the consolidation of declarative learning, so recalling what we know, things that you can tell others. So really, we need to see sleep a little bit like a save button on the things that you have learnt. So your brain takes in everything during the course of the day, and then overnight it all gets transferred and organised and therefore sleep prepares us and our brains for learning the following day. So there's been much research into the impact of sleep and lack of sleep on learning and cognition skills in young people. There are many studies around this, and overall the studies show that if we try to perform a task and we've had the adequate amount of sleep, we're often better at it, and we're more able to retain the task. However, there have been studies that show that if we ask people to learn new facts and they haven't had enough sleep, this can reduce their success rate by about 40%. So the hippocampus, the part of our brain which processes memory, is a bit like an email inbox. And so those people who had enough sleep, they were able to use this part of the brain efficiently and able to process the memories associated with the learning of new skills. So really, if you've got any young people that you are supporting who are in the habit of staying up all night trying to revise, to cram for exams, it's actually a very ineffective way, because the information won't have been stored to recall in the assessment or the exam the following day. So yeah, and unsurprisingly, if you've not had enough sleep, it impacts on motivation and concentration. And even by increasing sleep by 1 hour, researchers found that this shows dramatic effects in young people in terms of their focus and attention, and their memory, and also their ability to solve problems. So even just that extra hour can make a big difference in terms of impacts on learning. And so also, unsurprisingly, a lack of sleep can impact on an individual's emotional well-being. And there was a study done in 2012 by Gruber, and they looked at two groups. One group had their sleep enhanced by an hour, and the other group had their sleep restricted. And the teachers, as part of this assessment, didn't know which children were in which group. However, the children showed particular difficulties in terms of their emotional well-being if they'd had reduced sleep. And in terms of sort of that being a day-to-day occurrence, a week-by-week occurrence, not just as part of a piece of research, the impacts longer term of sleep problems can be poor mental health. So we find that people with poor mental health have poor quality sleep, difficulties falling and staying asleep, or also can maybe sleep too much. And all of this can be linked to specific mental health conditions. So conditions such as depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia also have sleep difficulties associated with them. So tackling sleep difficulties, disruptions to sleep, it's really important that we intervene as early as possible. So this slide just gives an indication as to the amount of sleep individuals should be having over the course of the different ages and stages that they're in. It is only a guide, and everyone will have some slight variations in that. But it's what's quite interesting to ask people who are struggling with sleep is some questions to sort of explore a little bit more about it. So do they need an alarm clock to wake up? How long does it take them to get up? How do they feel during the daytime? Do they feel okay, refreshed, or do they still seem tired and maybe a bit irritable? Do they require stimulants to help them stay awake, such as caffeine, energy drinks, etc.? So that's perhaps a more interesting way to explore how much sleep somebody is requiring. There is some research to suggest that in Western societies, um, many adults and children are undersleeping by roughly about an hour each night. So actually, if you add that up across the course of the week, that equals the equivalent of a full night's sleep. So thinking about particular groups, I want to focus on teenagers and the patterns and information about their sleeping cycles. So research is showing that on average teenagers are getting around 5 hours sleep a night. So obviously that is significant less than they should be getting, which is about between 8 to 10 hours. And it's reported that about 50% of teenagers report sleep difficulties. And research has shown that on average teenagers sleep 1 hour less a day than teenagers 20 years ago did. So that is pretty much cutting off a tenth of what they need every night. And you know, this also sort of runs alongside data that shows increases in anxiety, fatigue, obesity, mental health difficulties, and attachment difficulties, which are increasing in the teenage population. So research in terms of brain development during adolescence and teenagers shows that there are two prime opportunities for neural pathways and development. And so it's important that teenagers have enough sleep because a lot of pruning occurs during adolescence. So this is where the brain becomes more efficient, working out which connections are valuable and most frequently used. And this kind of pruning happens primarily during non-REM deep sleep stage 3. Also, what you find with teenagers is that they no longer find it easy to fall asleep at night, and so their body clock has shifted and they find it difficult to go to sleep, say perhaps 9-10 o'clock at night, and they're staying awake longer. And this is because melatonin, which is naturally produced in the body during the teenage years, only comes into effect later on in the evening. And obviously, if you've got a teenager who is struggling to go to sleep and then is having to get up early to go to school, this can begin to get a bit problematic. But in reality, asking a teenager to go to bed at 10 o'clock is a bit like asking an adult to go to bed at about 7 or 8 o'clock. So it's quite a tricky situation. And so the temptation can be to think, oh, well, I'll catch up with my sleep on the weekends. However, sleep doesn't work that way, and actually sleeping too much can disrupt the body clock, and also then it sets up the week for a bad start. And there's lots of emerging research around the impacts of technology, using technology before we go to sleep. There's been a recent increase in sleep problems during the mid-teens, and accessing stimulating videos or content before going to bed is likely to impact on the young person's ability to successfully get off to sleep. So here are some top tips of how to support teenagers who are having sleep difficulties. Just sharing some of these with them might be really quite helpful. So realizing that a lot of people their age will be struggling to sleep, that they're not being lazy, that actually, there is some biological explanation as to why they're struggling to sleep and then subsequently wake up. Trying to keep clear routines about bedtimes and wake up times during the week and the weekends, and making sure that they don't stay in bed even if they are awake, that they get up and they start moving around. Thinking carefully about what they do before they're trying to go to sleep. So again, going back to that point about electronic devices, stimulating activities, maybe not exercising too close to bedtime as well. And perhaps adopting some practices that are mindful, that are relaxing, that might help the young person have a bit of a more natural, easier wind down to going to sleep. But also really important is thinking about what they may be eating or drinking in the few hours before they're expected to go to sleep.
Okay, so what can you do? How can your school or setting support? And first and foremost, we're sure that there is lots that you are already doing to be supporting your children, young people and their families. But hopefully this list is either useful or validating of the existing ideas that you already have in place. The first one, stating the obvious, but is to listen to parents, to make space for them to share, to offload, or to tell you when there's been changes occurring for a young person or their family. Maybe they've had changes in sleeping arrangements or bedroom arrangements that mean the impact of the young person and their siblings, or even parents and carers as well, has been affected. And the second point on the list is trying to, within that, stay out of assumption and judgments. Sleep is arguably the most emotive subject for families because everyone will be simply doing the best that they can do to try and get by. And linked to this, the third area is that we as schools and educators, we might need to be flexible in our expectations and our approach, including our morning timetable arrangements, because ultimately settled composed starts to the school day is the priority. And we can all think of pupils and students who've been needing to kind of maybe gradually extend their time in school or to build their stamina for school and learning once more. And we might be needing to try and reset a sleep cycle or a circadian rhythm that's unhelpfully slid and changed and adapted over time. We might need some time to bring that back towards a circadian rhythm, a sleep routine that is a bit more conducive with getting up and getting ready for school in the morning, and flexibility about timetable arrangements and arrival routines might be really crucial in the middle of all of that. When we're planning sleep support, ideally involve both parents and anyone else who's involved in bedtime, because that consistency of approaches is key. And if there's a separated family, a separated household, involving the adults from both households if you can. Try wherever possible to support families to make a plan during the day for how the ideal sleep or bedtime routine would or could look. It's easier to do it that way in a preemptive sense and to try and gradually install some new habits or some good habits, rather than trying to do that at the end of the day in a rush when everybody's getting tired. So it's about helping young people and families to persevere, because those changes can sometimes take time to happen. I mean, it can take over 2 weeks at a time to start shifting a sleep cycle, even gradually back towards where we might want it to be. Number 6 is that if the child or young person is experiencing any anxieties towards sleep, well, that's about reassurance. So first of all, reminding children that sleep is a normal process, or reminding them that going to bed on their own and settling on their own is a normal process as well. Maybe it's about giving children a feelings diary or a little notepad next to their bed that they can jot down any ideas that they want to get out of their head, because we know that anxiety or worries or busy thoughts disrupt sleep. I particularly like the resource. If you go to a website called sugarandsloth.co.uk, they have a notepad product on there called the Bedtime Brain Dump, and it's an A6 shaped notepad, and it's just a way of getting those ideas out of a young person's head and onto the page, in the hope that that's helpful. You may want to teach children about breathing exercises, mindfulness, headspace, those sorts of apps that give children and young people that physical relaxation that might bring on melatonin and might help that sleep process. And it can also be helpful to remind children that most things grow when we tend to them. So we try to make sure we get that sleep in because it's part of being a growing young person, and that sleep's a helpful and supportive process. But also reminding parents that not to try and manage any anxieties the child has at, say, 10:30 at night, as they're likely to become more worse at that point in time when we're all feeling tired. And last but not least, number 7, remaining mindful of any cultural differences and avoiding looking at sleep through a British lens only. For example, different cultures might have different opinions on where the child should sleep, who they should sleep with, the idea of co-sleeping, and it's important to acknowledge, but also to, wherever we can, make parents of all different cultures and backgrounds aware of sleep safety first and foremost.
So one of the things we want to be supporting parents and families with are thinking about the bedtime routines that they've got in place and making some adaptations to that. So what we want to be thinking about is what time the child or the young person should be going to bed, and it's possible to work that out by keeping a sleep diary. And then once you've worked that out, you need to think about what's going to happen in the sort of 30 minutes before they're going to try and go to sleep. So that, are they going to read a book? Are they going to have a bath to help them wind down? And so we want them to be doing something that's not overly stressful, stimulating, but things that are going to be quite relaxing for them. And then thinking the steps before that is giving the child or the young person some sort of countdown to warn them that they're going to go into that lower arousal and stimulus activity. So thinking about, warning them that they're going to be ending looking at something on a screen or finishing an activity that's perhaps a little bit more stimulating. It's important as well that we're not adding in things like heavy snacks, so they don't feel too full and uncomfortable before going to bed, and making sure wherever possible that we are being positive about sleep time, making sure that they feel safe and they feel calm, because if we start to get uptight about them going to sleep, that is likely just to exacerbate the problem.
Okay, so the next area to think about is the sleep environment, the physical environment of the bedroom space. This is about establishing as much as we can in terms of what we can control, the right environment for sleep. And it might be helpful for all children or young people, including those with special educational needs and or sensory processing needs, to undertake a sleep bedtime sensory audit to look at any aspects of the bedroom environment that we can adjust in some way to try and minimize some of those sensory disruptions and to promote restful sleep. So first of all, it's thinking about the location of the bedroom in relation to the rest of the house. What rooms are they near to? Are those rooms particularly busy and noisy? For example, are they above the kitchen or near the bathroom? Are there periods when those rooms are busier? Do those periods clash with the young person's bedtime? Are there certain smells and sensations coming out of those bedrooms that are going to be disruptive to that young person on a sensory level? It's also about thinking about the temperature of the bedroom environment as well. So their room, their bedding, is the room too warm, too cold? Is the young person's bed pushed up to the radiator so the bed gets artificially heated at bedtime and then the temperature suddenly drops off? Does the radiator creak and clunk as it's warming up or cooling down? But we also need to think about external environmental factors as well. So are there noises from the road outside if the young person's bedroom is on the front of the house? Particularly difficult if we need to open the bedroom window in the hotter summer months. Are there noises on their side of the house if they're adjoined to next door neighbours, for example? Or are they sharing a room with an older sibling that comes to bed much later, for example? So it's all about paying attention to what might be overly stimulating or uncomfortable in terms of triggers for the young person at bedtime. Is there anything that we can be doing and controlling around sights, sounds, lights and textures? So when we think about a sensory friendly environment for the bedroom environment, there are things that we hopefully can control. So in terms of auditory and noise, it might be about minimizing noise with white noise machines, a bedroom fan or some soft music, considering earplugs that the young person can wear at bedtime or those ear loops to try and soften some of those specific sounds. We can think about visuals, the lightness and brightness of the bedroom, ensuring wherever possible that the bedroom is as dark as possible. Maybe the young person wants to wear a mask if that's comfortable, and free of distractions so that they have as reduced artificial light as possible, no toys that glow or light up in the bedroom, anything that could be distracting in some way. Are we thinking about a blackout blind that can really help bring about that quieter, darker environment because we know that that's useful for melatonin production? Tactile input into the bedroom environment as well, so choosing comfortable bedding, comfortable pajamas, loose clothing, but equally thinking about weighted blankets or sensory items that bring a deep sense of pressure and impact for that young person, because we know that that's soothing for many as well. And also thinking, is the mattress too firm, too soft? We need to think about the olfactory sensory system, which is to do with taste and smell. Are there any strong or unpleasant smells that the young person is exposed to within or near to their bedroom? For example, is there a plug-in diffuser on the hallway outside that's quite a strong and distracting smell? Or can we use sensory input in a sense that is calming and soothing for that young person, such as a lavender mist spray for their bedroom pillow, or maybe it's a chamomile tea just before bedtime as part of that wind down routine? And are we blending in movement, appropriate movement, into bedtime routines? So things that feel slow and steady, that give that sense of moving and winding down. So using sensory movement techniques, some rocking, some gentle swinging, some deep pressure touch, maybe bedtime massage, to try and help that child or that young person to wind down in a way that feels comfortable. Are they laying down to read their bedtime story, because that is an association with sleep? Are they chilling in a comfy beanbag in the corner of their bedroom, because again that gives that sensory sense of slowing down and winding down? And for me, perhaps the most important thing to think about in terms of the physical environment is what we call sleep associations. So thinking about what the bedroom feels like in a sensory sense at the point that that young person drifts off to sleep. So what's the noise level like if we've got background music playing? What's the lighting like? What's the temperature like? Because as we've seen from that earlier hypnogram, as a young person drifts through their patterns of sleep, they have points where they naturally drift into lighter sleep and when they temporarily awake. If they wake and the conditions of the bedroom have stayed the same, they're more likely to drift back off to sleep. However, if they stir in that natural way but notice that the room is somehow darker or quieter, particularly for younger children, that's going to be particularly disturbing and alarming perhaps, and might cause them to wake at that point. So just thinking about those sleep associations and how we can keep them as consistent for the full night's sleep, the full sleep cycle, wherever it's safe and appropriate to do so.
So thinking about sleep hygiene and things that are helpful, there's a range of things on this slide here to consider. But whatever changes you're thinking of making, it's important that you do those well in advance of bedtime and plan and prepare for them at a point during the day when you've got a bit more cognitive capacity to deal with it. You're less tired. So planning about how you're going to manage and adapt your environment so it's more suitable for promoting good sleep. I do think it's also important to remember that some of these adaptations, particularly to the environment, are going to be very impacted upon in terms of the context in which the family lives. So if a family is in temporary accommodation or rented accommodation, there may be some limitations as to some of the things that they can change that will promote better sleeping in terms of the quality of the accommodation and the ability to control things like heating, lighting, noise and space. But these are all things that probably feel very familiar to you, about routines, about not exercising too close to bedtime. We know it can be very helpful in winding down, but we don't want it to overstimulate us. Making sure that we've had exposure to daylight to sort of help that natural body clock sort of wind down as the evening gets darker. Obviously not having the room too hot if you can avoid that, and thinking carefully about the lighting. So picking things that are more pink or red is more helpful according to the research. Keeping it quiet if that is something that's within the family's control, and using the bedroom if possible as a sleeping space as opposed to a multifunctional space. That just will help minimize the distractions for the child or young person.
And to add to the point that Dawn was making just there, sleep hygiene practices, the don'ts, the things to try and avoid doing wherever possible. So first of all, access to TV screens or any other forms of screens and devices wherever realistically possible for the final hour before sleep, because we know that access to screen time can reduce the production of melatonin, that sleepy hormone. Try to avoid engaging in stimulating activities before bed, so anything that's going to bring about adrenaline or that will lead to the young person to be more kind of revved up and animated and energized. And instead it's about gently reading a book, maybe listening to a calming podcast or audio book, colouring time for younger people, maybe using some sensory soothing sensory toys, for example. Linked to that, obviously, avoiding exercise too close to bedtime, and also trying to avoid going to bed too hungry, because that will also disturb us as we dip through those cycles of sleep and those periods when we're more likely to just stir. If we stir at that point and notice that we're really rather hungry, that's going to affect the sleep pattern as well. So there are certain foods, if you Google them, that provide sustained energy through the night time if we have them as part of the bedtime routine, but also which bring on the natural production of melatonin as well. However, linked to that, try not to have too large of a meal before bedtime, as I'm sure we can all relate to. There are sometimes ways in which our food can weigh heavy when we go to bed on a full stomach that will in itself disturb sleep. Trying ideally to consume caffeine after 2 p.m. Easier said than done for many of us, I'm sure, but that also can prevent that stimulation of that adenosine that we were talking about on the earlier slides. And also drinking alcohol or smoking before bed, particularly as far as parents and carers are concerned.
So to just reflect on everything that we've considered during this spotlight, then we know that sleep plays a vital role in both our physical and mental health, and it's important to be aware that some people have sleep difficulties, but actually some frequent night wakings are normal. And if we're trying to support a family, it's important that we bear in mind the impact it has on the whole family. And if we are going to be supporting a family to try and adjust their sleep routines and habits, it's important that we make this plan during the day when people are less tired, when the prefrontal cortex has more capacity to take on board the cognitive information that we want to develop and adapt to help them. It's going to be difficult for someone to implement changes to a sleep routine if they're sleep deprived themselves. And so, unsurprisingly, because this is actually quite a common area of difficulty for people, sleep disruption, sleep difficulties more generally, there are many national and local support services. The statistics suggest that about 80% of children with special educational needs have some form of sleep problem during their childhood. So there is thankfully a lot of support out there from national helplines such as the Sleep Helpline, but also more at a local level through the Family Information Service for our local families. And additional things that you might want to be aware of are sleep charities that have been set up and are suggesting that there is a sleep manifesto in Parliament. And also very recently, Dunelm have produced a range of resources to help the older teenagers get better sleep before they head off away from home to university. So again, there's a range of resources and organisations out there to help all sorts of families, whatever their sleep difficulties may be.